right, ladies and gentlemen, greetings and salutations. I am Akil, and welcome to what I hope will be the first of many episodes of Cancel Culture Club. And of course, for those of you who aren't familiar with the 80s music scene and the Second British Invasion and so on, of course, that's a play on words based partly on the name of the British pop band of which I've become a fan in the last couple of years, Culture Club. So I figured it would be a nice little pun to combine that with cancel culture, which is something we hear so much about in the news these days. And I just want to sort of have a rolling conversation about this whole issue of cancel culture going forward, but based on a case-by-case analysis of different cancellation incidents, because I feel like cancel culture is not the kind of phenomenon that can be just simplified and judged as purely good or purely bad across the board. I really do think that there are some cases of, where the outrage mob is frankly justified in coming after certain people, and other cases where it's clearly not justified, and in other cases where it sort of falls into a gray area, somewhere in the middle, and it's very debatable whether the cancel culture mob, so to speak, has any leg to stand on or not. Joining me for this conversation is my esteemed friend, Charles Boyd, who is one of the most reasonable and level-headed, as well as intelligent, educated, and well-informed voices I know on current affairs. So Charles, thanks for joining me as always.
Well, thank you for the epic introduction. I'm definitely going to try to live up to that.
Cool. And obviously you've done a number of conversations with me in the past, but it's been a while. So if you could just give a quick background or like summary of your background for anyone watching.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I am an instructor of history at Georgia State University. I've written significantly. I've written a lot on sort of historical issues. Also, tried my hand at fiction writing. I specialize in American slavery and abolitionism, but I'm very interested in civil rights issues generally. I recently sort of revived a podcast called Minority of One, where you can find on SoundCloud. And essentially, I should mention I'm also applying for a PhD program currently, so I may be able to eventually say that I have a PhD. But in general, I think that one of the reasons I was interested in doing this is that I think that social injustices, especially related to issues like race, women's rights, LGBT rights, etc., that social justice issues are one of the most important things that we as a society have to essentially make good on. I also think that there are sort of aspects of sort of what you might call social justice warrior culture, which is something that is present on the internet. It's not limited to the internet. I think there are aspects of social justice warrior culture that have taken on troubling similarities with the right, with sort of social conservatives, and unfortunately have started, using maybe tactics and sort of outlooks and arguments that have some disturbing parallels. So I think that threading the needle in these kinds of cases is very important, and that's part of why I'm on here.
Great, fantastic. So let me just switch. And I would say when it comes to cancel culture in general, obviously, like I mentioned, I think that there are those who will say, I would say they typically tend to be found on the political left. They'll decry complaints about cancel culture or even the use of the term cancel culture on the grounds that it's overblown. It's similar to sort of right-wing scaremongering about the phenomenon of political correctness back in sort of the late 80s and the 90s. And then in reality, if you look at public figures who've been so-called canceled, they actually don't usually get completely canceled. They usually just end up being able to bounce back from whatever backlash they suffer for having said or done something controversial. And their careers don't usually end up being completely permanently ended. And I think there's examples of that being the case. For instance, I remember in 2007 when the sort of, I guess you could call him a shock jock in ways, Don Imus, the morning radio show host in New York, made that remark about the Rutgers women's basketball team being nappy-headed hoes. It was a huge controversy, and I think he was kicked off the network at first, but then by the end of the year, he was back on the air, if memory serves. So that kind of thing does happen. You do have your public figures who bounce back from a cancellation episode. But I think there are also other cases where you can really argue that, like you said, there are elements of social justice warrior culture where certain people are condemned for saying things that are, whether, the question of whether they're really offensive or not is kind of debatable, I would say. Or sometimes the whole issue is just a misunderstanding. And this is why I think it's important to discuss cancel culture episodes case by case. In this case, I mean, before we delve into this one particular recent, some might argue current incident concerning Ilya Shapiro of the Cato Institute, I was actually curious to get your take on that general aspect of cancel culture. Like, do you think that it can be said to be a good thing or bad thing across the board, or do you think it's important to look at each case on its own merits?
Yeah, I think it's vital to look at each case on its own merits. And that's why before I comment on a case like that, I usually like to do a lot of research on it and, sort of make an informed decision on the individual aspects of that case. So I think that there are certain situations in which somebody's actions or even sometimes statements that they make, just depending on the situation and the context, are so egregious that there's really not a viable path forward, in my opinion, for them to continue to work in the career that they've been in, whether that's running a business, whether that's filmmaking, what have you. Now that's a very distinct question from people trying to say that, well, like if somebody were to say that you can't enjoy any movie that Harvey Weinstein ever produced, I think that's an overreach. But I also think that Weinstein, I don't see a viable path where I'd be okay with him continuing to work in Hollywood. Like it's just his actions went too far. On the flip side, there's other cases where either a person's statements or actions simply weren't deserving of cancellation, or in some cases, you really have to kind of weigh what the likely outcome is if you try to cancel them, because some of these people that, so you have people, some people, who get quote unquote canceled, and then that pretty much is the end of their career. You have other people that try to get canceled and they end up making more money and getting more notoriety than they had before you tried to cancel them. And even, apart from that, it very much can fuel sort of the martyr narrative when you try to end somebody's career. So it's something that the devil's very much in the details. And I'm not sure that social media always encourages people to think through some of the stuff before they opine on it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, Harvey Weinstein is one of those fairly extreme examples of someone who I completely agree richly deserves to be canceled, in the sense that he himself should not be able to work. You'll never work in this town again. I mean, his ass should be in jail for decades.
Yeah.
So there is that. But just reputationally and professionally, yes, he absolutely deserves to be banished from polite society, to say the very least. I think that example actually, and I think you touched on this, it raises an important question when it comes to the conversation surrounding cancel culture as well. What does cancellation consist of? Does it mean merely that the individual person, himself or herself, needs to be canceled in the sense of being boycotted, ostracized, whatever? Or does it also mean that, for example, you can no longer respectably consume that person's past work at all? does it merely mean that that person cannot or should not be honored with certain accolades? For example, a few years ago, I did an interview with a friend of mine from New York who's an actress about Casey Affleck, Ben Affleck's kid brother, winning an Oscar. I forget what the name of the movie was, but it was controversial because apparently he had been accused of sexual harassment, I think, on a lot of the movie sets that he'd worked on. And I remember when I interviewed my friend, she pretty firmly opined that he did not deserve to get the Oscar, regardless of the artistic merit of his work. She felt that it was just wrong for Hollywood to honor him that way. The whole argument that you should be able to separate the artist from the art didn't wash for her. So because I think the way she put it was she felt that that was just another way of saying men's convenience is more important than women's feelings and experiences, something to that effect. So, it also depends on what you mean by cancellation. And the tricky thing is, it's not as if this is the legal system imposing a concrete penalty that is determined and limited by things like mandatory minimum sentencing laws or maximum sentencing laws or other guidelines. You know what I mean? It's not as if judges are constrained by precedent. This is the court of public opinion at the end of the day. And so each individual person, frankly, gets to make up his or her own mind about whether to cancel somebody and what it means to cancel them. And there's going to be disagreement to some extent. I've also read articles in recent years about artists who said and did really controversial things. And if anything, their popularity went up, quite possibly partly because of that martyr complex that you mentioned, as well as people wanting to sort of, I guess, stick it to the outrage mob and push back against what they perceive as cancel culture. So it's a really complex situation. In this particular case, and maybe it's really fitting that I start this series with a discussion about this particular individual because I happen to know him personally and I've actually worked under him as well as even socialized with him once or twice over the years. Ilya Shapiro, who is a scholar at the Cato Institute, the flagship libertarian public policy think tank, who was a legal scholar, practicing attorney. He's also I think he runs the constitutional studies program at Cato. And when I interned there just over 8 years ago, in the fall of 2013, he gave me several instructions, several assignments to complete. So this is someone I actually know, in addition to which we also share the same alma mater. We both went to Princeton. He's class of 99, I'm class of 2008. So this is someone, as public figures go, I guess you could say I actually know him fairly well. What did he get himself in the hot water for saying or doing? Well, he actually tweeted a series of tweets, 3 tweets, in which he said, responding to Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer's decision to step down, to retire from the court, and President Joe Biden having promised during the 2020 election campaign that he would nominate a Black woman to be on the Supreme Court. Ilya Shapiro said, objectively best pick for Biden is Sri Srinivasan, who is a solid progressive and very smart. He even has identity politics benefit of being the first Asian, that is Indian American, on the Supreme Court. But alas, that doesn't fit into the latest intersectionality hierarchy, so we'll get a lesser Black woman. Thank heaven for small favors, ? And then the next tweet said, because Biden said he's only considering Black women for SCOTUS, his nominee will always have an asterisk attached, fitting that the court takes up affirmative action next term. Final tweet. This was a poll tweet. Is Joe Biden racist and sexist for saying his Supreme Court nominee will be a Black woman? And then you had these options you could click on to vote racist, sexist, both, or neither. My understanding is he deleted these tweets afterward. I don't know. Have you heard anything about him issuing any kind of public statement about this since then?
So I want to say, I think he said that they were that what he said was inartful or something to that effect. I mean, I think it was kind of one of those, I haven't looked at the full statement, but I think it might've been one of those kind of, not a full-blown apology, but trying to sort of walk it back or hedge a little bit.
Right. Now, my understanding is that he also, I can't remember if he's already been given a position at Georgetown Law School or whether they had recently nominated him to that position. but I do know that Mark Joseph Stern, who's a legal blogger at slate.com, has, and a graduate of Georgetown Law School, apparently, has already, I think, in fact, he was the one who drew public attention to Ilya Shapiro's tweets, and sort of got the cancel culture machinery cranked up in this case. And, he's put out a number of tweets of his own. I guess, yeah, he says he tweeted that Georgetown Law had already hired Ilya Shapiro, yada, yada, yada. And he tweeted, Shapiro would have accused any Black woman nominee of having a lesser intellect, even if Biden had not announced his demographic criteria beforehand. That's how he smeared Sonia Sotomayor, even though Obama never promised to nominate a Latina specifically. And he actually cited an old tweet of his from back in 2009, of Shapiro's from back in 2009, I guess, where he wrote on CNN.com, not a tweet, an article. He said, in picking Sonia Sotomayor, President Obama has confirmed that identity politics matter to him more than merit. While Judge Sotomayor exemplifies the American dream, she would not have even been on the short list if she were not Hispanic. She is not one of the leading lights of the federal judiciary and far less qualified for a seat on the Supreme Court than Judges Diane Wood and Merrick Garland or Solicitor General Elena Kagan. Interesting that he cited three people, two of whom later ended up, one of whom later ended up on the Supreme Court, and one of whom was nominated, but of course his nomination was thwarted. So even it shows that Shapiro is a close Supreme Court watcher and a watcher of Supreme Court appointments. But in any case, what's your overall response to this? Does this strike you as one of those cases where the outrage mob might have more going for it, more of a leg to stand on, and saying that this comment is so unacceptable, so beyond the pale, that he should be removed from this position he has at Georgetown Law, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
So there's a few sort of distinct issues here. I would say that, first of all, the comment is certainly racially offensive for a variety of reasons. I think that, one of the key reasons is the fact that, pretty much anytime you use the phrase lesser Black woman, or there's no positive way that you can spin that kind of phrase. It's a very tasteless way and a very racially charged way to refer to somebody. But I think that the other sort of big issue that I have with this, besides the sort of very demeaning language that he used, is that we have not had a meritocracy in this country when it comes to who gets these kinds of opportunities. It's not as if we had a colorblind nomination process for judges throughout US history, and then Biden suddenly came in and changed that. The fact that there has never been a Black woman on the Supreme Court is not because Black women are inherently less qualified to be on the Supreme Court, because they are inherently equally qualified. But what the reason that there's never been a Black female Supreme Court judge is because we, especially historically, but even still today, we haven't had equal opportunities for women and racial minorities in this country. And that sort of ties it, I think Shapiro with this tweet is really acting as though Biden's promise is occurring in a vacuum and not sort of intended by Biden as kind of a corrective to the historical lack of diversity on the court. And I would also say the asterisk thing is very offensive in my view, because Eric Foner has talked about this when he graduated from Columbia University in probably would have been like early to mid 60s. And he talked about, Columbia had a few non-white students. I think they probably had a few female students, but there was still a lot of very unequal opportunities about who was getting into the school. And, Foner basically said, look, I and all of my other white male classmates were very well qualified, but if we'd had a completely level playing field with admissions, a lot of us might not have gotten in. And what Foner kind of goes on to talk about is that he never, white guys who graduated from Columbia in an era when there was a lot of racism and sexism in the admissions process, they never had to have, quote unquote, an asterisk with their career. People just sort of assumed that they had earned it. So this assumption that it's always a meritocracy until affirmative action gets thrown in the mix is, I think, a very ignorant statement. Now, whether this is something that he deserves to lose the job over, like, in kind of a moral sense, I would have to really do more of a deep dive on his views about race. My sense is that he's made some pretty ignorant statements, but that his racial views are less bad than a lot of people on the right. Now, I think the third issue is whether, from a practical standpoint, it's a good idea to deny him this position, particularly now that he's already been hired for it. And I don't think, on balance, that it would be beneficial to anyone to not give him the job, because it's always inherently opening up a can of worms when people are fired, especially in a university environment, for political statements. It inherently creates a very tricky issue of trying to decide when it's acceptable to do that. And then also, once you, I mean, the right has been using that tactic since the word go. So the right's in no position, regardless of what the left does, the right's in no position to claim the moral high ground. But still, when the left uses that tactic, they can't then turn around and say that it's wrong on principle if it happens to someone on their team. And that is an inherent risk that you run when you try to sort of use these tactics. I would also say that at this point, particularly given that the comments that he made are so normal for prominent people on the right to make, and given the fact that many prominent people on the right have made far nastier comments, honestly, I think that any attempt to, quote unquote, cancel him is going to probably lead to him making more money, getting more speaking engagements, more publicity, and just sort of feeding the narrative that cancel culture is this thing that leftists just cooked up to ruin people's lives, which, again, is not really true. But I think that at this point, there's less harm from giving him the job than there's going to be if we try to make a martyr out of him. That's kind of and like, I'll just say this, if I were a student at Georgetown Law, at this point, I would probably try to avoid taking one of his classes if I could. This is not somebody that I would really want to deal with. But I also think that if you fire people for their political views at all, that needs to be done very sparingly. And I think at this point, the potential cost outweighs the benefit to doing it.
Right. Yeah. It's like you say, it does open up a can of worms. Personally, I would say, before going any further, the first step is I feel like he has a hell of a lot of explaining to do. And I say this to say the very least, and that's kind of a threshold position. Like you say, I'm sort of leery of saying that Georgetown needs to sort of boot him from his current position. For what it's worth, it looks like a dean at Georgetown, dean of Georgetown University Law Center, has already sent out a school-wide email condemning Shapiro's tweets. It writes, Ilya Shapiro, who was recently hired to direct one of Georgetown Law's research institutes, posted a series of tweets on Twitter that he has since deleted. The tweets' suggestion that the best Supreme Court nominee could not be a Black woman and their use of demeaning language are appalling. The tweets are at odds with everything we stand for at Georgetown Law and are damaging to the culture of equity and inclusion that Georgetown Law is building every day. Sincerely, Bill, Dean William M. Trina. Obviously, that statement does not state clearly whether they're going to take any concrete steps beyond that condemnation. I would say it probably just depends on how much public pressure is applied to them and how long the people behind that pressure can keep it up. Personally, and I'm going to say that this is partly influenced by my personal acquaintance with Ilya Shapiro. This is someone who, like I said, I was in more contact with roughly a decade or close to a decade ago. From what I remember of him, would I say that he has a consciously, explicitly racist bone in his body? No, definitely not. Absolutely not. Might he suffer from implicit racial bias? Not only can I not rule out that possibility, but I would also say there's a tendency among people in the conservative movement. he worked for a libertarian organization, but there's more. It's actually quite commonplace for people who don't consider themselves, scholars who don't consider themselves libertarians across the board, to work at Cato, even to be in positions of authority there. So merely working at Cato doesn't necessarily make a libertarian out of him. I've always gotten a bit more of a conservative or maybe conservatarian vibe from Ilya Shapiro, but then again, I've never heard him specifically or explicitly state how he self-identifies ideologically. So I guess that's question's a bit up in the air. But I would say that it's safe to say, at the very least, he has a massive blind spot when it comes to issues of race and racial justice and equity, which I have to say is distressingly common among libertarians in general. And look, I'll just say it, white libertarians in particular, white conservatives. And I'm talking about people who would never in a million years dream of consciously discriminating against or slurring Black people in general, members of any other racial minority groups. For whatever it's worth, Ilya Shapiro is a Jewish American, actually Jewish Canadian. I forgot to mention that earlier. One other thing he and I have in common is that we're both originally from Canada. He grew up in Toronto, and he's actually an immigrant to the United States by marriage, if memory serves. So we actually have quite a few things in common. And he is of Russian Jewish ancestry. I know that, and it mentions that in actually this National Review article that I had linked to you, and it's obviously written in his defense, and it talks about how his background, coming from a Russian Jewish background, whose parents I think grew up in the Soviet Union, he was that sort of influences the way that he looks at a lot of these issues. Where the hell does it say exactly? It says, oh, wait, I think I have it here. The son of Russian Jewish immigrants, he has over time developed an essentially universal reputation for scholarly rigor and good humor. Let's see. Actually, there's something else that would more specifically referred to that. Yes, he has, let's see now. He has done two things that the left will not easily forgive. One, consistent with his distaste for the anti-Jewish quotas that his parents faced in the Soviet Union, he was an early supporter of the lawsuit against Harvard's race discrimination against Asian Americans. Obviously, this is a conservative writer, Dan McLaughlin, at the conservative publication, National Review, who is opposed to affirmative action. And so, of course, he's characterizing Harvard's affirmative action policy as race discrimination against Asian Americans. Then the author, Dan McLaughlin, goes on to say, just a week ago, so this is actually a recent development, Georgetown Law announced that it was hiring Shapiro to be executive director and senior lecturer at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. Academic pursuits of that nature are seen by left-wingers as their exclusive province. And whenever a conservative or even a right-leaning libertarian gets hired into one, they immediately set out to get them fired by any means necessary. So I think that's a bit of an overstated, hyperbolic description on Dan McLaughlin's part, although I do think there's a nugget of truth to the claim that a lot of folks on the left really believe that conservative intellectuals or libertarian intellectuals don't belong anywhere near certain positions of academic prestige, because they honestly believe that those ideologies have little or no intellectual merit. By no means is that a universal attitude on the left, but I do think it's not entirely uncommon either. And does that attitude play a role in the efforts to get someone like Ilya Shapiro removed from that position at Georgetown? I wouldn't put it past some folks on the left to approach it that way. But on the whole, I would say that inartful, as Ilya Shapiro reportedly described his own tweets, is putting it really mildly, much too mildly. And one thing, I mean, if I ever had the opportunity, and hopefully one day I will have the opportunity to chat with him about this face to face, or maybe online like we're doing now, I would ask him, do you actually get why people of good faith, mind you, not just left-wingers who just can't stomach the thought of a conservative or libertarian in a position like that at Georgetown Law, but people of good faith, even folks on the left who are genuinely politically open-minded and so on, and yes, they do exist for the record, can you understand why even those folks, and particularly those in the Black community, would be deeply, deeply offended and outraged by your statement? And I would want to try to get inside his head. I would say that people in his position and of that kind of political background don't tend to fully grasp the nature of the arguments for greater diversity, greater representation on bodies and in institutions like the Supreme Court, the judiciary in general, positions of power in American society in general. One thing that people have pointed out is that, and you alluded to this earlier, there have been more than 100 Supreme Court justices throughout the court's entire history now. And I think only 7 of them so far have been anything but white men. And I think it's quite right to point out that that's an affirmative action of a sort, out of a much more invidious sort than you could ever say about Joe Biden promising to put a Black woman on the Supreme Court during his presidency. I mean, I do think it makes sense to say, well, of course, anyone we nominate to the Supreme Court has to have basic legal qualifications. That should go without saying. I think it does go without saying. I think even a lot of the people who are criticizing Biden for that promise know better. I think they know damn well he's not going to nominate anyone who's just manifestly incompetent. I can't even think of that many examples from history of presidents nominating someone who really did seem to be manifestly. I can think of one example off the top of my head. I'm sure you remember this, 2005. Remember when, I guess it might have been when William Rehnquist died, former Chief Justice? It might have been then. I can't remember if this was the nomination that ended up being Samuel Alito or Chief Justice John Roberts, who were nominated and appointed around the same time, late 05, early 06. But initially in the fall of 2005, while I was actually taking a course in constitutional interpretation at Princeton, George W. Bush initially nominated his lawyer, Harriet Miers, to the Supreme Court. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
And this was at a time when the Republicans had majorities on both in both houses of Congress. And, you would think that Bush would have been riding high, although he had just actually gotten kicked in the teeth twice that year by the failure of his Social Security reform effort and the fiasco of Hurricane Katrina, not to mention escalating violence in Iraq. So actually it was sort of a triple whammy, but he made this nomination, and even a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill were saying, come on, what is this? You nominate your lawyer to be on the Supreme Court? And apparently even Vice President Dick Cheney privately said, he didn't even have the guts to talk to me about it to my face, and this is absurd. And so he had to withdraw that nomination. But generally speaking, I can't think of many other cases, if any, where someone who was just manifestly legally unqualified was seriously nominated by a president to the Supreme Court. It should go without saying that whoever is nominated has got to be qualified, but there's no reason why you can't say, well, they got to be qualified, and it's an added bonus that he or she come from a demographic that's underrepresented on the court and in the judiciary in general. And I say that as someone with libertarian political leanings myself. I don't see what's wrong with combining those two goals. They're certainly not mutually exclusive. They're not. A lot of people like to talk as if they were, but they're not. There's no reason you can't respect the need for merit and competence and still serve the goal of diversity. And I think that that's something that Ilya Shapiro's overlooked. I think that's something that Dan McLaughlin's overlooked, that all these Republicans and the Fox News crowd and the rest of them are overlooking. For starters, we haven't even heard who the damn nominee is going to be yet, right? I mean, Biden hasn't announced that yet, correct?
Yeah.
So I think that it's a little absurd to even get so deep into the weeds of, oh, well, he's going to nominate a lesser Black woman because he made this promise during the election campaign. We don't even know who the hell we know who's on the short list. We have some ideas. I suspect Ketanji Brown Jackson might end up being the nominee, but until we know who the nominee is, I don't know that it makes sense to get so deep into the question of qualifications. And at the end of the day, the fact that so many conservatives are doing that, spouting all this rhetoric, suggests that they're speaking in bad faith, right? I think, among other things, they're just using this as a tool to bash Biden and the Democrats, which is to be expected in politics. But in addition to that, I think that this kind of rhetoric this early in the game reeks of bad faith. And I think that there's an element of unconscious racial bias to it as well, as if to say, well, I mean, if it were a conservative Black woman like Janice Rogers Brown being nominated to the court, I'm sure they'd have no problem with that. They probably cheer it. But, whenever it's a liberal Democrat or Democratic nominee, there's all these issues relating to race and so on. For him to say, I agree with you that for him to use a term like lesser Black woman. See, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about when it comes to white, particularly white conservatives, blind spots on race. Lesser Black woman. You typed, it wasn't even like you popped off at the mouth and just blurted that out in a hot mic scenario. You typed that out on the screen of your phone or your tablet or on a keyboard and posted this as part of one of 3 tweets on Twitter. And only when the backlash began, the blacklash, as I like to call it in certain race-related contexts, only then did you take the tweets down and say, oh, this was inartful of me to say. The fact that it didn't occur to you up front, even with the obsession over race and racism in American society overall, and the conversation on race that's been going on since at least the civil rights movement, if not earlier, the fact that it still didn't occur to you that that would raise some dander, that to me says something about the kind of mentality that you bring to discussions concerning issues of race. And I mean, that's me being pretty charitable as I think I can be towards someone like Ilya Shapiro. I mean, like I said, I did work for him when I interned at the Cato Institute. He was fair, he was cool, he was chill. I wouldn't say he was especially warm, but that's whatever. I mean, at this personality, I would say that he is someone who has a lot of work to do and a lot of introspection to do when it comes to racial issues, not just when it comes to choice of words, but when it comes to the substance of his attitudes towards these issues as well. And it's not as if you can't make any legitimate arguments, non-racist arguments against affirmative action or against diversity, in taking diversity into account as a criterion when making appointments to the Supreme Court or any other body. But although I happen to disagree with those arguments, but this is an atrocious way to go about it. You know what I mean? So that's sort of my take on this. I think he's got a lot of explaining to do. I think saying that it was merely inartful doesn't even begin to cut it. And I'm sort of 2 minds as to whether I wouldn't say he should be denied, I should say removed from his position at Georgetown, unless perhaps he sort of digs in his heels and takes a very stubborn position on this and refuses to back down, refuses to apologize, whatever, or explain himself. Then I could see them maybe saying, well, if you're going to make a remark like this and then, you know, stick to your guns and not show any respect for the Black community's feelings on the subject, then I could see maybe saying, yeah, I don't know that you're very well cut out for a position like this. But if he's willing to have that conversation, explain himself, and hear out the other side, especially the feelings of folks in the Black community, if he could do that to my satisfaction, I would be content to see him stay on in that Georgetown position. I don't know how you feel about that approach, though.
So I think that there's a couple of concerns that I have with that. I would say that, first of all, I honestly sort of doubt that we're going to be getting much more of a retraction than what we've gotten. I also think that to the extent that we got one, it would likely be insincere at this point. You know, it would likely come off as, you know, very rehearsed. And I don't know if I don't know if there'd be much benefit to him giving an apology that he doesn't really mean. I would still have a lot of concerns. I think any attempt to remove him from the position, in addition to the can of worms it's going to open up, it also probably will give him a career boost. You know, because you look at somebody like, you know, and the Jordan Peterson situation was different in certain ways because there were serious concerns about his behavior directly affecting how he interacted with students. Because you have a free speech right, in my opinion, to say whatever you want, like, you know, transphobic, racist, whatever, without prosecution. But there's standards that you have to follow in a school or workplace situations that you don't create a hostile environment for students, coworkers, etc. But even with the Jordan Peterson situation, I mean, yeah, the guy isn't going to be teaching at a university again anytime soon, but he was making, last I heard, he was making something like $960,000 a year, basically talking about how the woke left tried to ruin him, you know, and I don't know I don't necessarily want to see that with Shapiro. I also think, to an extent, Georgetown University, they had to have known. I mean, this is not the first time he's made a comment of this variety. You know, we saw it with the Sotomayor thing. I think that to some extent, Georgetown University kind of has to lay in the bed it's made a little bit. Like, they hired him and presumably either didn't do a significant vetting of his previous comments or didn't think they were disqualifying. And I think that at this point they kind of have to honestly kind of take the bad publicity to some extent, because they made a hiring decision that hopefully they did their homework on before they made it. And I think that they're going to have to kind of just deal with the fact that they're going to be getting a lot of criticism for hiring a guy who's made racially offensive statements. You know, I also think, honestly, I don't see him getting fired, because Georgetown, my impression with the administration is that it's not super liberal. Like, I think the faculty skews pretty liberal, but my impression is that the administration is a lot more moderate. So I don't see him getting fired, but I think at this point, I wouldn't be extremely sympathetic to him if he got fired, but I'd be very concerned about sort of what the fallout was going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it would be very easy for someone in his position, should he be fired, to parlay that, to spin that and parlay that into an advantage professionally by getting in good or even better with political forces on the right, who would then, I mean, I'm sure he would get all kinds of interviews and guest spots on Fox News and other, other outlets within the right-wing media echo chamber as a result of that. Sort of like what's happened with Kyle Rittenhouse, you know, since he became one of the latest cause célèbres on the political right. So I think you're quite right about that. It probably wouldn't have much of a constructive result. And see, that's the thing about cancel culture in general. And I think this is a good place for us to wrap up the conversation, is that to come back to the general theme of cancel culture. One thing that I think a lot of people need to keep in mind when joining an outrage mob in a particular case or considering joining it is, I mean, what good is it going to do practically in the long run? If you look at disinvitation incidents that have occurred on college campuses, for instance, when people like Charles Murray or Milo Yiannopoulos tried to come to speak on, or Ben Shapiro, tried to come and speak on certain college campuses, and certain student protesters reacted violently in some cases. You heard them often use rhetoric suggesting, well, we're trying to protect students from being exposed to this bigoted speech. And it was as if they thought that they were somehow insulating, or I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Inoculating the student body from contamination or infection by the contagion of these evil, bigoted right-wing ideas, which is absurd, because by staging these protests, you're actually drawing more attention to the controversial speaker and his or her controversial speech. You're going to enable this person to make a martyr out of himself or herself. A lot of people, even who are ideologically sympathetic to you in the public square, are nonetheless going to feel the need to speak out against whatever violence might have happened in that category of incidents. And usually, I mean, I think I remember after Milo Yiannopoulos was canceled or disinvited from, Berkeley campus back in maybe 2015 or so, didn't his latest book, shoot up the New York Times bestseller list or something like that? I mean, and then at the end of the day, even if the idea in theory is to shield students on the campus from being exposed to these ideas by keeping the speaker physically off the campus, ultimately, any student who wants to learn more about what Charles Murray or whoever has to say can easily just Google it, look it up on their dorm room computer. And what the hell is a protester going to do to stop that? Nothing. So that's just another related example of a case where I think certain manifestations of cancel culture are just completely fruitless. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what are you hoping to achieve by trying to cancel someone? Are you actually trying to shield a certain population or populations from being exposed to their speech at all on the grounds that it's harmful for them to be exposed to it? Or are you really just trying to punish this person for having views that you consider reprehensible and expressing those views in the public square? Even then, you may not achieve your mission, because ultimately, if they're able to make martyrs out of themselves and, parlay the whole thing to their advantage, really your effort to cancel them has backfired. But that's one of those things that, again, vary from case to case to some extent. And like I said, that's why I think it's important to look at all these situations on each one of these incidents, rather, on its own merits. In this case, Ilya Shapiro, somebody I've been cool with in the past. Like I said, I don't think he has a consciously racist bone in his body, but in terms of problematic attitudes towards these aspects of the race relations issue in American society, I can't get him off the hook here. Not just because of this latest comment, but like you said, his earlier remarks about Sonia Sotomayor more than a decade ago, it suggests that this is a long-standing attitude of his. And this I think you can even get into the weeds of his remarks about about Sonia Sotomayor. He said she's not one of the leading lights of the federal judiciary, but at the same time, if you look at her background, this is someone who graduated summa cum laude from, I think, Princeton, and was an editor of the law review at Yale, et cetera, et cetera. It's not like she was just some bum off the street or some third-rate lawyer from a third-rate law school or undergraduate college or anything like that, right? So, what are the criteria you use to determine who is or is not one of the leading lights of the federal judiciary, yada, yada, yada. And yeah, he brought up the example of Sri Srinivasan, another person of color who's liberal, progressive, whatever, who he thought would have made a better nominee, but and who also comes from an underrepresented demographic on the Supreme Court. But I don't think that gets him off the hook at all. I think it just you probably threw that in there to try to, and that's something too. I think it raises the question, well, why did he bring that up? Was it because he knew that these tweets in advance would be controversial and thought that he could use that first tweet and his shout out of Sri Srinivasan as a way to cover himself and defend himself against the inevitable accusations of racism, give himself plausible deniability against those accusations, or what have you? Maybe. Do I know him well enough to know whether he could be that cynical? Not really. If you're someone who's willing to give your political opponents or, well, partial opponents, because he and I agree on some things and disagree on others, do you have to give them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to that sort of thing? I don't know. I'm less inclined to do so after he made a remark like this. But I think you're right, though, that he's not likely to we're not likely to get much more of an explanation or apology out of him. We should, in principle, but you're probably right that we probably won't. But what do you think last question, like, how do you think that this particular incident, do you think that it says anything new about the overall phenomenon of cancel culture, or is it sort of just same old, same shit, different day?
Well, in some sense, this isn't that unusual. We have a lot of instances like this. On the other hand, I think something interesting that this says is that if Shapiro, which is what I'm predicting is going to happen, keeps the job that he's been promised and potentially gets more, kind of speaking gigs and press coverage out of this, then it is going to once again raise the question, which honestly has been raised, or should have been raised a lot before. It's going to raise the question about what does it actually mean to have someone be canceled? Because I do think we haven't, as a society, we haven't distinguished between cases in which somebody actually successfully gets canceled, cases in which people try to cancel someone and it doesn't work, and honestly, cases in which people just say harsh things about somebody on social media. I think that this case, will, or at least should, sort of keep the conversation going about what exactly the definition of being canceled is and whether it's being overused to apply to certain. The right. I think the right's definition seems to almost entirely depend on whether the target is being canceled or trying to be canceled by the left versus the right, because people will tie themselves in knots to try to claim that nobody even tried to cancel Colin Kaepernick, which, whether you think he actually got canceled or not, it's very clear that to whatever extent he wasn't canceled, it's not from lack of trying by people like Trump. So I think that this is going to, hopefully, I'm not holding my breath, but I'm hoping this is going to lead to more sort of thoughtful conversations about how we define cancellation and cancel culture.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I mean, Trump said that people, Colin Kaepernick and athletes like him who kneel during the anthem shouldn't even be in the country. So in other words, you're trying to say they should be stripped of their citizenship and deported? Yeah, you're a real big believer in free speech there, Donald. Yeah, right. But yeah, I think you're quite right that my hope is that this will, but of course, mind you, this is my hope every time there's a cancellation incident, and I don't know that it actually happens, but of course, every time like you say, I hope that it does contribute to more enlightened and nuanced conversations about cancel culture and when it should and should not apply. Fingers crossed, but I can't say I'm holding my breath, waiting for that day to come. But we'll see. Time will tell. But yeah, I want to thank you, Charles, as always, for joining me, because I always leave every conversation we have feeling better informed and more edified about a given issue or topic than I was at the beginning. So always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure for me too. I always feel the same way about conversations with you. I definitely, you're one of my favorite people to talk to.
Word up. Likewise. Great talking to you again, and talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Later.